Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high quality student books, teacher guides and unbeatable value revision resources for GCSE and A-level sociology. The Sociology Show listeners can also get 25% off Collins Sociology resources until the end of December 2021, including the new book, How to Be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and university. If you are interested in any of Collins' resources, including that book, then simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology show and enter the code sociology show at the checkout. Terms and conditions do apply. The Sociology Show is also brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And you can visit their website, which is tutor2you.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode was Dr Karenza Moore from Newcastle University. And I talked to Karenza about her research on clubs, clubbing culture, drugs trends, consequences of drug use, and drug prohibition. Unfortunately, the connection went at a few points during the interview, so it does sound a little bit funny at points, but it's more than listenable. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview with Dr Karenza Moore from Newcastle University. Karenza, thank you very much for joining me.
No problem.
So, Karenza, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, please.
Sure. Okay, so I am a drugs researcher, drawing mainly on the disciplines of criminology and sociology. And I've been writing about mainly recreational drug use around young people, particularly in relation to kind of leisure spaces. And I've been looking at that for about 18 years now. So my main focus, as I said, is drug use.
And I'm always interested how people got into their particular area. I know you're obviously talking about club music and dance music and so on as well. I'm guessing you were into that from a young age yourself.
I was, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, especially around, for drug researchers that are looking particularly at dance music cultures. There's quite a lot of drug researchers that I know that sort of started off as participants, I guess,
yeah.
And then kind of moved on. And this is the same for me. Started off going to raves in the sort of 90s. And actually did my PhD about young people's ideas of versions of the future around mobile technologies. So whilst I was doing my PhD, also going out in London, I started writing, my first paper was about using kind of reflexivity to try to investigate young people's participation in dance music cultures, and also how they kind of compared themselves to more kind of maybe mainstream, at least as it was at the time, cultures focused around alcohol. So the first piece that I had published, a book chapter, and then it kind of went from there. Over the years, I have looked at, sociology, technology, and gender and technology, actually, but my main kind of focus of my research has been drug use and also aspects of dance music culture which have really interested me. So, for example, I looked at trance clubbers' kind of ideas of themselves and the kind of maybe spiritual discourses that they drew on to kind of explain their participation in club cultures. So yeah, it's always been there, but it definitely started off as a kind of personal interest, I guess.
It's one of the first things that really got me interested in sociology myself, actually. So I was doing my A-level sort of, early mid-90s, and Sarah Thornton's research on sort of drug culture,
Yes, definitely.
ecstasy
Yeah.
and so on. And I was like, wow, you can actually research something that you're really passionate about. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be dull,
Yeah. I mean, I think, I actually think sociology is incredibly well equipped to kind of engage with youth cultures more generally. I mean, if you think about, because I'm also involved in the youth studies community, and, a lot of youth studies scholars use sociology, kind of critical approaches, and a passion for talking to young drug users or clubbers or any kind of group that I feel can be quite misrepresented. So to give you an example, recently I've just written a book chapter around how I think young MDMA ecstasy users are quite highly stigmatized. And although there might be a kind of mainstreaming of festival culture to a certain extent, actually in terms of the kind of focus of, say, law enforcement, policing on the ground, policing of leisure spaces, that actually MDMA remains quite a stigmatized substance for young people to use. So yeah, I think the tools of sociology, our sociological imagination, are kind of really ripe for investigating the kind of meanings that they give to drug use in the context of clubs. I think often it's perceived as quite a hedonistic, almost like a meaningless activity. And there's historic reasons for that. But I think actually when you talk to young clubbers or drug users, it's not necessarily just a kind of hedonistic pursuit, although there is elements of that, obviously. But it's actually something that gives young people meaning. It gives them something kind of solid to hang on to in this sort of, I suppose, as Bauman would say, like a liquid modernity. It gives them something solid to hold on to, often drives their kind of tastes, their interactions with other people, even their political action. So yeah, I guess I'm just saying that I think sociology and sociological imagination is particularly good at engaging with these kind of maybe quite stigmatized groups, but also groups that are, consumer groups as well, and they're consumers of dance culture, which is obviously, as we're kind of found out in the pandemic, it's this huge £1 billion industry across the globe, which is currently being affected by the pandemic. So that's, I think it's really helpful for scholars to use some of the tools of sociology to understand some of these cultures.
And you said you've been looking at it for a long time now, 17, 18 years. What's really changed? The scene has changed dramatically, hasn't it? From drifting into mainstream and becoming more popular and more underground. I mean, what are the biggest changes you've seen since you've been doing your research?
Wow, yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I think the main thing maybe is the relationship that drug use situated within what we might call dance cultures has changed. So there has been changes in patterns of drug use over the last, we've had like 30 years of kind of acid house, dance music cultures. And so in that sense, there's a very kind of established scene. But over those 30 years, I think probably the main thing has been some of the change in drug use, changing patterns of drug use. But interestingly, there's been this kind of what we might call a kind of persistence of ecstasy and the centrality of MDMA ecstasy in dance music scenes in particular. Having said that, I'm thinking back now, it was early 2000s. We did a study around ketamine use, for example, and the kind of emergence of ketamine as it was popular amongst gay communities for quite a while, but emergence of ketamine, particularly at after parties, and then to a certain extent also in the main kind of dance music spaces. And so that's, that kind of emergence of new drug trends is something that I've been very interested in because, the main reason is obviously related to harm reduction. For me, that's a very important part of my research. Yeah. Finding out about young people's drug use and what kind of emergent trends so that we're on top of being able to give these young people, the right advice for them in the right language that they can kind of understand and that they feel an affinity to. The other thing is the regulation has changed a lot. So just focus on ketamine. It was made illegal in 2005 and so brought under the Misuse of Drugs Act. And it was interesting to see, or it has been interesting to see, the kind of changes in terms of patterns of consumption. And actually what's happened is since it was made illegal, the growth of its use has continued. So making a substance illegal doesn't mean it goes away, which is what the government seem to think often. So I find that really interesting. And the other thing that was interesting around ketamine was the kind of resistance amongst some people in the scene, saying that this kind of drug kind of ruined the scene. And I thought that was very interesting, that there are certain kind of bodily demeanours and ways of kind of being within these particular spaces that people, think are acceptable, and sitting in a corner in a K-hole, I think is perhaps deemed not acceptable. So I think it's interesting. People often think of dance music spaces, and this has been the case over the last 30 years, as these kind of, as I said, really hedonistic spaces. There's no rules, anything goes. Actually, these are very regulated spaces, in terms of regulation from the government, but also from people within the scene. The expectations of behaviour, especially say around binge drinking. If you're in one particular space where alcohol isn't the focus and someone turns up, and they're really drunk or whatever, then, that person becomes, an anomaly almost in that particular space. So I think that's really interesting. There's a lot of kind of norms in these spaces, which I think people maybe don't realise.
That's really, yeah, I'm really interested in that, the sort of the quality of the drug, how that impacts the scene as well. If you speak to a lot of old school ravers, they would say that, half a pill would last all night, and then they started to get watered down, and then they became crap, and that did have an impact on the scene.
It did.
Impact.
Yeah, it did. So, that was such an interesting period. I think we're out of that period now. But so we're looking at kind of 2009, when we saw the emergence of novel psychoactive substances, and in particular methadone, MCAT. And we did a lot of work around methadone at the time. And what was really interesting is that one of the main kind of reasons that people moved to methadone was the poor quality of MDMA and also cocaine at the time. And I thought that was really interesting. And people were talking about methadone as if it was the kind of new kid on the block that everyone would move to. Of course, what people kind of found out, that actually methadone, basically it's amphetamine. There was quite a lot of issues with it. So young people did use it for a while. We found quite high prevalence, and it's still used within gay communities, within the gay kind of club scene and hookup scene as well. But actually what happened is, as soon as MDMA kind of re-emerged as higher purity and stronger pills, which is the situation we're in now, people moved back to MDMA. I definitely think the drugs change the scene, and the scene changes the drugs that are popular. So obviously we've seen, the rise of binge drinking. It's a different situation now, but there was that kind of binge drinking culture where, cocaine became more prevalent, and is actually still prevalent in England and Wales. Yeah, so I think it's interesting how there is definitely a relationship between the drug use and the kinds of practices within these particular spaces. It's funny what you say about, back in the day. I think there's quite, and I do this myself, there's quite a lot of interest in nostalgia. Yeah. And that kind of nostalgia, thinking, sociologically now, I guess, is drawn upon by participants and sort of promoters of nights and that kind of thing. So you've got some great events. There was, before the pandemic, there was an event in Blackpool called Back to the Old Pool, which I thought was great. So yeah, I think there is nostalgia for a kind of reconstructed version of the past. Again, one of the other things that's been interesting is the way that illegal raves have been talked about during the pandemic, and I've been thinking about the way that they were talked about, when they first emerged. And there are quite a lot of similarities. But what I think is people forget is that during the rave era, there were these pay parties. It was actually quite dodgy, and I know people do romanticize it to a certain extent. But in the 90s, it wasn't all all good either. So I think that's worth remembering. And the other thing I think that's happened is that there's quite a division now between people that put on illegal raves and the free party scene. And I think that division is kind of important to remember that in terms of drug use in different spaces, whether they be regulated or unregulated, there's different risks and harms, but also pleasures for young people. And I think that's really important. So we've seen this kind of festivalisation of culture in the sense of, the prominence of festivals and them becoming almost like a rite of passage for young people to attend, not necessarily just dance music festivals, but any kind of festivals, the drug use that's involved in that as well. And we've seen some interesting work around harm reduction, focusing on young people as well in those particular spaces. So I think I think there's a lot going on, but I'd like to think of, whenever I try and think of writing about MDMA or writing about young people with drugs, I try and think of that 30-year period and how things have kind of, some things there's continuity and change. And I like thinking about, what's stayed the same and what's changed. And I think that's quite a nice way of approaching this particular field of research.
That commercialisation thing is interesting, isn't it? Certainly, I'm going to a festival in August, and it's kind of it's got a family feel to it actually. But some DJs playing are old school DJs who would have done like the dodgiest nightclubs and warehouses back in the 90s. And it's interesting they're now going to be DJing to, family and children and stuff dancing around.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Of course, I've thought about this actually. If you think about, I'm not going to ask how old you are, but if you think about people that are, have been going out either DJing or as, were ravers, now clubbers, got family, got responsibilities, but still, again, were involved in the scene. I'm thinking Dave Haslam, actually. He's a really interesting example of a kind of Manchester DJ that's almost like a kind of bit of a spokesperson for kind of nightclubs and dance music. And I know Dave still plays out. I think there was a Manchester International Festival recently, just like a Tuesday night. There was a house music DJ that was playing a load of old tunes. So I definitely think it's something people like to, hear again. But also, what I find fascinating, because personally I'm quite into techno, is that actually though these scenes are quite young, and techno in particular in the UK, it's quite a young scene, say, compared to the trance scene. And so I find it interesting that we have people, in their 40s that remember the old days, and then youngsters now that are experiencing this for the first time, and how there are some commonalities, almost like cross-generational commonalities in terms of the way people behave and the way that they kind of talk about their involvement in dance cultures. So and just going back to what we said about commercialisation, there was that moment, I guess, in the early 90s where, rave was criminalised. Raves then had to kind of go into regulated spaces. That's where we get the kind of 24-hour licenses that nightclubs like Ministry of Sound had in the early 90s. And then obviously we saw the kind of expansion of that into the sort of super club. And I think it's really interesting because there's always been this tension between the commercialisation of the scene. Ultimately it's about consuming an experience, but also consuming and spending your money. But there's also the criminalisation of the scene at the same time, and a kind of deep uncomfortableness, I think, from the mainstream and kind of mainstream political organisations about dance culture, whatever form it takes. And I think that we're seeing that at the moment in relation to the positioning of nightclubs as these kind of literally high risk spaces. But that's always been there. So I think there's an interesting kind of in a relationship between that commercialisation and the criminalisation. So if you think about a big dance music festival, there's a particular festival in the north of England, which is pre-pandemic was nearly 200,000 young people, absolutely huge. And I think what's interesting about that is if you go to that festival and other festivals, the policing, the kind of securitisation of the site with the sniffer dogs, strip searches, all that kind of stuff. That's the criminalized element of it.
Yeah.
You get in that space and you can buy alcohol, you can buy all kinds of stuff. You can also buy drugs, obviously, as well. But I think it's really interesting because we have this huge, mainstream, basically, commercial festival, which is policed in a way that, I can't actually think of many other spaces that are policed in the way that festivals are policed. So I think it's interesting. There's that tension, and young people have to negotiate that as well. And sometimes I do get worried, that young people are negotiating the criminalisation of their activity, which can kind of undermine their harm reduction practices. So seeking help if they get into trouble, having had too much MD or whatever it might be. I think that tension of commercialisation, criminalisation doesn't necessarily serve young people very well in terms of reducing the risks and harms of their drug use in those spaces.
There's a slight irony there as well, isn't there? I've got a few friends who are police officers, and if you ask them the choice, would you rather go and police, a rave or a house event or an alcohol-fueled club?
Yep.
There's absolutely no question which one they'd rather police. They get,
of course,
very few problems at most of the house events, certainly. So that's really, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, in terms of incidents of violence, I mean, this is almost an unsaid thing. I haven't really seen that much research in, comparative research in terms of different spaces and levels of violence. But I think it's something that we all know by being involved in the scene. That go into a music. See, I think of them as the sort of drug-focused events, house nights or whatever, nightclubs. But they're sort of drug-focused, but they're mainly music-focused, and I think that's probably the main thing. So people are going, young people, not so young people as well, but people are going to these spaces because they want to consume music with other people. And we've seen that, haven't we, in the pandemic, the kind of rise of the house party, where people want to, interact with others. And particularly in the nightclubs or, warehouse parties or whatever, people want to consume music together. So alcohol actually isn't that useful a drug to do that. No. It's not. We always say it's interesting. If you go to quite a big commercial night, you'll sometimes get people consuming alcohol there and, obviously having a good time and stuff. But often those people will leave quite early. So we sort of think, it's about 1:00. So most of the drinkers will go home. And then the people that are taking MD or whatever else kind of stay till the end, So I think it's interesting that even the time and the different sorts of people in the crowd changes over the course of the night, or it can do depending on the venue. So I think that music-focused spaces where people take drugs are seen still as problematic. I understand what you're saying about friends that are police officers, and I've got friends that are bouncers and are the same. They'd much rather be working at the door of a dance club than a very kind of alcohol focused space as well. So I think that tells its own story, really, doesn't it? And interesting thinking about, particularly for women, gay communities over the years. Dance cultures and nightclubs have been these kind of safe spaces where people can. Yeah. You'd hope they could express themselves. Obviously, I'm not saying there are not issues with sexual harassment, and I know there's been some interesting work around that in terms of festivals. But I do think, generally speaking, if you think about the alcohol-focused nighttime economy and then perhaps the more music and drug-focused nighttime economy, I think there is quite a difference in terms of the gender relations, in terms of people outside of the mainstream maybe being able to express themselves in a space where they feel comfortable doing that. And I think the low levels of violence is related to that as well.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
what do you think of, Karenza? I'm interested to know. We've talked about the commercialization. One of the things that I kind of lost a little bit of love with the scene was the money involved. You know, you're talking about how much to get into a venue. I used to go to Ibiza every year, and the prices crept up, and before you know it, they're charging €80 to go and watch David Guetta, something like that. And you just, to me, that wasn't what the scene was about. The scene was a dark, dingy nightclub, and again, that might be a sign of age. But along with the commercialization came the money attached to it as well, didn't it?
Of course, yeah, and that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that I suppose it depends how broad we put the parameters around the particular scene. So, there still are those dark, dingy nightclubs, particularly in some genres. I mean, you can get into a small, thinking of a night I went to pre-pandemic in Manchester, a very small techno night. I think it was like £7 to get in, quite aimed at students and young people. I must have been the oldest person there by about 30 years or something. But so I think there are still those spaces. Obviously, those spaces have been particularly hit by the pandemic, and that's very worrying. So I'm not sure what we're going to see when we come out. But I agree. I mean, ultimately, dance music and club scene festivals now, people need to make the money to keep going, but there is a lot of money involved, and also in terms of drug dealing and drug distribution, there's money to be made there as well. So I think it's interesting that often when we're talking about the scene, we kind of think we sort of forget about people that might be excluded from the scene for financial reasons. So I had a fantastic PhD student, Dr. Nick Woodward, who's looking at young people and leisure consumption at the moment with me. And what we found really is that there are whole kind of huge swathes of what we would probably refer to as working class young people who just haven't got the financial means to regularly get themselves involved in aspects of the scene. And so that the expense, the price of things does price them out. And they often, then end up hanging around maybe on the streets or, producing their own kind of scene. So I definitely think there are elements of the scene that are exclusionary. I think the other thing is that there's quite a lot of racism around as well in terms of what kinds of nights are put on, what kinds of music are seen as acceptable or not. There's racism on the club door. There's racism in terms of drug policing, and young Black and Asian young men getting refused entry of dance clubs. So I think that's also quite interesting that sometimes there might be quite an idealised version of the scene that we have in our heads. And I do agree that it is like that, but there are also issues in terms of, exclusion of certain groups of people as well.
And Brenda, I never actually asked you about your kind of research itself. You use kind of mixed methods, don't you, to find your information?
Yeah. So, as I was saying at the beginning, I like using different methods. I guess I probably started off with participant observation, drawing on my own experiences. And then I often do interviews. I really like doing interviews with drug users in particular, finding out about, we did this paper, again, it was about ketamine, and it was like, asking people, what's it like? Why do you do it? How do you keep yourself safe? What's the most fun part of this particular kind of drug use? So I like really delving into people's experiences. And of course, that all helps in terms of producing harm reduction recommendations as well, because I've always believed that the more you know about what young people think about drugs, how they use them, and what they do in the spaces that they frequent, that if you know that, then you're always going to be much more likely to produce good quality harm reduction information. So I think that's really important. I also like doing in situ surveys, so just go into the spaces where young people are, getting them to fill in surveys with you, which is amazing fun. Everyone wants to tell you their story. So I've had some really fun Obviously I'm there working, so it's not like I'm raving with everyone, but also, just asking people, well, what drugs have you had tonight? What drugs are you planning to have? Have you ever been had to go to hospital for any reason? All that kind of stuff. I love that. And I'm now sort of moving a little bit more, obviously, towards online surveys as well. I found online surveys are kind of an interesting way to capture young people's drug use. The Global Drug Survey, you probably heard of that.
Yeah.
Fantastic initiative. Gathers loads and loads of data. So, I really do believe that very well produced statistical data where people acknowledge the limitations of that data, that's important, but good quality statistical data is really important for understanding young people's drug use. And if we don't know how many young people are taking a particular substance, then we're not going to produce good knowledge about that and produce harm reduction material as well. I suppose the other thing I do like doing in relation to mixing methods, I'm often quite focused on policy. And doing a kind of deep dive into particular drug policy. Recently done a report about with the Beckley Foundation about the possibility of legal regulation of MDMA. So we produced our own kind of roadmap. I didn't have 4 stages, but we produced our own roadmap, cycling through the possibility of moving towards legal regulation of MDMA. We looked at the kind of risk profile of the drug, so there was some kind of scientific engagement there as well with a colleague, and then kind of setting out policy options, and looking at exactly how might these policy options be implemented. So I am very interested in the relationship between the kind of data that you can get from mixed methods, but also policy analysis and trying to produce new policy ideas, to try and think about where we're going now as we're coming out of the pandemic, I guess.
And actually, now you just mentioned it, if you don't mind, I did want to ask one last question, which is about that. Fears that the pandemic has decimated the nightclub scene. Many nightclubs have sadly had to shut down. Yeah. Where do we go from here, Karenza? Can it recover? Can it get back on its feet? And if so, what direction is it going to go in?
Oh, wow. That again, I wish I had a crystal ball.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that nightclubs are dealing with, and any sector, leisure sector more generally, but particularly, venues in the nighttime economy, not just nightclubs, but nightclubs being particularly affected. I mean, we were kind of first to shut and last to open.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a source of concern for a lot of people. I mean, I think there's also been, so that's the uncertainty, isn't it? I think the uncertainty is actually driving a lot of the issues that are kind of emerging now. I think that nightclubs will continue. I know there has been a lot shut, but I do also know quite a lot that have diversified their space. For example, there's a really interesting, I'd call it a warehouse space really, but a nightclub space, I guess, in Salford actually, and Manchester, and they've diversified. They've had like art gallery installations. They also have a kind of side hustle, I guess, would you call it, a side hustle in DJ equipment, sound systems, that kind of thing. So I think the ones that will continue probably will have to kind of diversify. They'll probably have to try out new things. I also think that the demonization of nightclubs, I think the kind of moralizing that there has been around dance music clubbing will continue, but that's actually not anything new for the scene. I think it's used to being kind of denigrated. I think that there isn't really any recognition that I call dance music and dance clubbing a cultural form. I think it's a particular kind of cultural form, like, an art gallery might present different works of art, in a nightclub we're presenting different works of music and different DJs. So I think it's a cultural form, and I think it's a cultural form that's been very much denigrated. I think it's also quite an easy target. And particularly because it's frequented, nightclubs are frequented mainly by young people. Young people are already positioned as kind of at risk or risky in and of themselves. So I think that the nightclubs and dance music scenes have got all that to cope with. But I do have a lot of faith. I mean, I think that there might be promoters maybe using different spaces that weren't available pre-pandemic. I mean, there's a lot of empty spaces in our cities now. So, I can see that happening. I can see promoters maybe using different spaces to put nights on. So, yeah, I haven't got a crystal ball. I don't think that people, dancing together, sometimes on drugs, listening to music with repetitive beats, it's not a new thing. I mean, we're talking about 30 years of dance music culture, but actually dancing together in an intoxicated state goes back a lot longer than that. So, yeah, I think it's hard to predict, but I don't think the scene is going to disappear. It will almost certainly adapt in the way that it's had to adapt, over the years. Rise of binge drinking had to adapt a lot to that. So yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, but it obviously will depend a lot on what happens over the next kind of 6 months, a year, I guess.
Yeah, I just wondered if it might strip back down to its basics again. We built it up, got more commercialized, got more expensive to these big super clubs, whether it is stripped down to the very basics again, which won't necessarily be a bad thing. But there you go.
Yeah, that's an interesting... I mean, I think that will happen, but also what will also happen is that the big players are the ones that have survived. So I think the big players, the commercial brands, will still be there. So I'm going to give you an example. I bought a ticket for a particular night, a techno night, pre-pandemic. It was cancelled. That ticket cost £12 when I bought it. And now the event is going ahead. There are still tickets available, but they're charging £35 for the same night, which, has not gone unnoticed amongst the fans of this particular DJ. So I think that's really interesting. I do worry. I mean, obviously nightclubs and promoters, they've all got increased costs now as well. So I worry that will kind of be, that will disadvantage the consumer in terms of the prices of getting into venues, because it's an expensive business ultimately, and it is a business. I've been very interested in after parties. I'm actually working at the moment on a project around after parties. And obviously with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of young people moving, or actually everyone moving more into having parties in domestic spaces, creating kind of mini raves in people's back gardens. And I think maybe that will continue. There's always been that, students often have house parties, don't they, with get DJs in and that kind of stuff. So I think there will also be, much more, informal parties, I guess. And I think that's always a good aspect of the scene. That's where you get to know people, I think.
Absolutely.
The after party chat. So, yeah, I find that very interesting as well. Different types of drug use, after parties, you're in a domestic private space. So people's drug use practices change quite a lot. And that's something I'm interested into as well. So.
Thank you, Karenza. I always ask people just to finish off by saying a little bit more about how people can read some of your work or add you on Twitter. Do you mind giving out some details?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, if you want to, I guess, look at the papers that I've written over the last kind of 16, 18 years or so, if you just type my name into Google Scholar, Karenza Moore, then they're all there, and most of them are available if you've got subscription to the library. And I've also got a website called clubresearch.org, and there I kind of post bits and bobs, so people are welcome to have a look at that, and also you can contact me, and my Twitter details and everything are there. So that's just www.clubresearch.org.
Brilliant, thank you. And your Twitter handle is
it's at Dr Karenza Moore. Yeah,
brilliant, excellent, thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Karenza, and let's hope that the club scene does recover and goes from strength to strength, even if it does adapt and change. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much, Matthew.
Thank you. Take care. Bye now.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.